You can start your way if you want to.
Hello there, VSTOLers. This report is basically a hodgepodge of flight test film that I found in another failed attempt to clean up the debris of all my keepsakes and paraphernalia back in one of the back rooms. We put it together with the help of my grandson, Justin, and it's not necessarily in the proper sequence. But since it is about tilt wings, we will start with the VZ2. That was a Boeing VSTOL that I know Roger and I flew it. I'm not sure about Bob's boy, but I first flew it on March of '65. Man, that was a long time ago. And again in January of the next year, and back again in April. Before I went to fly it, naturally I had a look at the flight test report of the NASA chief pilot, who was Jack Reeder at the time, and he described his hovering attempts as very much akin to riding out a hurricane in the top of a palm tree. I must say it didn't inspire too much enthusiasm, but that was about 5 years before our flights, and in the meantime they had modified the wing countless times, the wing leading edges and various and sundry other things. So you can see from this film that the tilt wing concept seems like it worked pretty well. It was no problem. The only really strange thing about it was with just the two propellers. You know how there's behind a speedboat, there's sometimes that wake of water that's going up behind it? Well, with the wing up and the blast coming down, there's a similar wake of air that you don't see going front and back. And so if you start moving forward a little too quickly, you can get into that rooster tail, if I can call it that, and cause a little bit of a nose pitch up. It was powered by a early version that was given by the Army. It was used for prototype UH-1 flights, and so it was just kind of put together by this and that. No ejection seats, because that would be too heavy and it probably couldn't hover when you did that. So some of our first flights there, we'll look at those, and I'll try to comment on them in just a little bit there. Okay, let's stop for a minute. My first XC-142 flight was down at the factory, which was, I shared the runways with Navy Dallas, and it was March of 1965. Of course, the Navy puke, Raj had flown that before that time. Somehow or another he managed to get stationed down there ahead of me. I'm not quite sure how he pulled that out, but he was a pretty smart guy. Some of the first shots that we have on the film, though, that's coming up, were from Point Mugu Naval Air Station. We had gone out there. One of the major tasks of the airplane was, what can you do with the thing? Where can you go? What can you haul? How bad is the downwash was a big one. And so at Point Mugu Naval Station, we were not using the runway. We were using the dirt, if I can call it that, off to the side. Now, it really wasn't dirt. It was just very loose blow sand with a little bit of grass that they put in on top of it. So you can see in these shots where we landed in it that we had a few problems even in that very first one. Well, it wasn't a problem. It worked very well. The nose gear, as you can see in the shot, is completely submerged in the sand. And as a matter of fact, the sand had wedged the front tires away from the rims, and so they were flat. So they tried to come out to see what was wrong in a Jeep, and the Jeep got stuck. The sand was so bad. So we just put the wing up to 90 degrees and hovered straight up, and then put the wing down a little bit and air taxied, air hovered over to the ramp and parked it long enough for the crew chief to fix the tires. And then we went ahead with our tests on that one. We moved around a lot. We went a lot of different places, just trying to evaluate operational suitability. At Edwards, you can see us landing out there in the desert. They had scraped some of the sagebrush off. Turned out later that that wasn't necessary, but you'll see the airplane landing in a very definite upslope. Because when you take off, if you'll notice, the airplane fuselage comes up level and the nose gear is still running up the hill there. We were able to land out in the middle of the desert most anywhere. We have some shots there at Navy Dallas. They had developed a backpack that had fiberglass, green fiberglass, and the concept was you could parachute a guy out, and when he got on the ground, he could spray this circular pad of fiberglass, and that would be the landing spot and takeoff spot for whatever you're going to do there. An interesting story about that I want to tell you about in a minute. But I think the next shot here was at 29 Palms, where they had some pierced steel planks. And as a matter of fact, we found out later that was the only runway they had. But again, we were looking at how much the downwash would bother, how much dirt, sand, and gravel would blow up. Is it going to be any problem? And it wasn't any problem. And then we made a practiced hover over it, and the downwash somehow or another got through the holes, and it kind of exploded right under the airplane. Just came apart. We found out very shortly after that there was a VIP inbound, and that was the only place that they could land, and the commanding general there was very irate. So we just put the wing down on the 1C-142 and went back to Edwards and left the helicopter guys to try to explain and help clean up what that little bit of a mess. We had a similar thing, and I think it's the only time that I remember being a little bit afraid. You can see that we had a canvas landing pad. They put a big hunk of canvas out, dug a trench all the way around, and then put sand on it to hold the edges down. And from seeing how powerful the downwash was, in my mind I could envision that as the downwash got to it, that maybe an edge would come loose and it would start flapping, and the next thing you know, we would be very neatly gift wrapped to be sent who knows where. Then we have my first carrier landing. I kind of think it was a Saratoga, I'm not sure. At any rate, we was from Edwards. We flew out to sea there and found the carrier easily enough, and rolled in, turned what I would think of as a normal base leg, and then lined up on the carrier deck, which was steaming into the wind. Put the wing up to the halfway, which is the normal STOL landing, short takeoff landing. Might mention that with the wing at the halfway up mark, 30 degrees, you can double the payload that you can hover with and take off in just about an airplane length. So I went to that normal STOL position, and I'm sitting there looking, and I became aware that the carrier was running away from us. He was steaming at a pretty good rate and had a headwind, and so he was doing about 41 knots, and I was only doing 32, so I had to put the wing down a little bit till I overtook it. So I put the wing down, overtook him, and as we came across the landing zone area, just gradually beeped the wing up, up, up till it matched his speed, and then slowly pulled the power off, and it just sat right down on the carrier there without ever even touching the brakes. We did hovered on it. We're again, ground effect. We're looking at what happens when you're sitting on a carrier and you hover left off of the carrier so that suddenly there's nothing under you. Will you sink? And with a helicopter, that's a very big deal. With the velocity of our downwash, it just didn't seem to make a whole lot of difference. At another point, we landed on I'm going to call it a helicopter tender. Roger, what's the right name? But it was a small one. They had most of the crew somewhere kind of out of sight or behind something so we wouldn't blow them overboard. But it was very simple as far as controllability and managing the downwash. It's heavy, but not we can handle it okay. And it was a piece of cake coming in and off of it. We have shots also from Bishop, California. That's where we normally took our helicopter tests for the high altitude work. And so we went up there, and you can see some hovering and short field performance, and that altitude up there didn't seem to have any real problem with us. But I remember I told you the operational suitability was the big thing that we're looking for. So the Army, Navy, Air Force, even the Marines, we tried to do tasks that they would do. And that's one reason that the tri-service team had Marine pilots, Army pilots, Air Force pilots, Navy pilots, and most of the maintenance was done by the Army, engineers. We even had some German engineers in there, so it was everybody was interested in it. So we looked at airdrops, just like a C-130, open the back cargo doors, and we had people jumping out. We had extractions of payloads, and we found out, for one thing, that you could make a very least decent delivery system by using that VSTOL capability, and we could just by adjusting the wing angle, we could tilt the fuselage to most any angle. And of course the cargo is sitting on little rollers just like on C-130s, so you could fly by at 32 knots or even slower and trip the cams that were holding it in place, and it would just roll out and fall. Leave it right there. You could put it in the paddies or most anywhere. We had people jumping at El Centro, the Navy. We had an Air Force detachment there, but that's a Navy base also, and they have experimental jumpers, and they try to perfect new cargo parachutes as well as people parachutes, and all of those things went very, very well. The next shot that I think you see here is of an airplane back at LTV at the plant, which is where Navy Dallas is as well. And we were just trying to do a rescue from a lifeboat. They had rigged a UH-1 winch and put it inside the XC-142. There was a fairly small hole right in the center of the cargo deck there for maintenance purposes, but you can see that we successfully, very easily, picked a guy up out of a raft floating around out in the middle of the lake there, and winched him up and put him on there. And in the background of that film, you'll see along the road a bunch of cars parked there. Actually, it's the highway through there, but every time we got out flying with it, there would be all kinds of people come to stop and get out, and take pictures, and try to figure out what it was. It's no film on this. I wish I did, but let me tell you about my parents came down from Oklahoma to Navy Dallas while I was there, and the publicity guys from LTV had cooked up a big demonstration for VIPs, government people, other industry people, and on their property, back in a bunch of trees, they had put up some bleachers, and they had sprayed one of the big fiberglass round pads. And the idea was that Stu Madison was flying, and I was flying as his co-pilot. Stu was the, of course, the company pilot. And so I called Mom and Dad, and they drove down, and I took them out ahead of time, and they didn't want to mix with the VIPs, so I put a couple of chairs for them removed from them where they'd have a good view, and told them I'd come back for them when we got through with the flight. Well, as Sue and I were getting into the airplane, the LTV guy came running up and said, we just changed the deal. You're going to come in from a different heading. It will be more realistic. So, okay, I hate those last minute changes, but that was a company thing. So what happened then, my mom and dad told me, the airplane came right across the bleachers as the wing was coming up and the downwash was getting intense. And it shook all those little trees, those little scrub oak trees, and it just rained ticks all over the VIPs. And so from that standpoint, it wasn't too good, although Stu and I thought it was pretty humorous, and Mom and Dad got quite a kick out of it. What they did is we landed, opened the back tailgates, a bunch of Army Guard people ran up into the airplane. We closed the tailgates, and then they started rolling the film again, and we opened the tailgates, and they all ran off, and then we took off vertically and flew out of the picture, so it looked like we landed with them. But at that point, we didn't allow anybody but the test people in there because it was just too early in the program. That's the first time I ever saw a herd of termites being rained, and they chose a very appropriate place to do it. Publicity guys were always trying to get us to do something. They wanted us to fly the governor into Six Flags, and you know, there you are, a prototype airplane, no concept of what was good or what wasn't. Another shot here that shows a very nice, we're sitting at Carlsbad, the Air Force Base, just very near LTV, and you can see us sitting there in a hover in front of the clouds. And the XC-142 was pretty unique in that you could run the wing down and go and convert to normal flight, either level or descending or climbing. It didn't really matter. And this is a good shot, shows you a level conversion, and things go very, very quickly in that mode. We'll quit for a while.
Sure.
I think the first airplane we took it to the first 142 to Edwards in June of '65, and I think the first full conversion of it was about a year, well, no, I think it's probably in '58, July. Shot here, a small boat down there in the water that you see is a Coast Guard PT boat, and again we're looking at downwash, so we're hovering over him and then continuing the downwash look. This next shot here over all the trees is down at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. You notice the paint job on that is just like the one that's over in the museum. It's just back from the Paris Air Show, and it's the air show paint job. But we were hovering over them, and they also had CH-47 and another large helicopter, I've forgotten which one it was. And so we were all about at the same gross weight. We had all those three ships up there, and then they had requisitioned all of the spare anemometers that anybody had from control towers, and you can see them all mounted out there in that shot. And we were all going to hover over there and see if we couldn't settle this downwash thing. And you see people standing out there, mostly Army, under the trees. Now what they're doing is walking around, and any time a tree limb blew off, they were to go get it and measure its size and note which airplane caused it to fail. So we're trying to figure out who has the most downwash. And basically it came out that if your gross weight was the same, we all broke off the same size branches. And the XC-142 succeeded in blowing all of the anemometers away, and we don't quite know where they went. And it wouldn't be fair to quit now without giving Roger, our Navy pilot, his day. Here's Roger's accident coming up. Like that, Roger? We're at South Base. Now, one of the problems with the airplane, they had given us special headsets. It was very noisy with 100% prop RPM. Now, actually, when you got to altitude, it cruised about like a C-130, about the same speeds at 25,000 feet. You could cruise along around 300 knots. And we would shut 2 engines down, and the remaining 2 engines would drive all 4 props. Instead of running the props at 100% RPM, we would pull them back to, I think, something like 75 or 76%. And it was really quiet, lovely machine. But to hover, we had always used 100%, and that's where the decibel level was really high. So the engineers had done some work, and they wanted to try to do, see if we could convert and hover and come into a landing at a reduced prop RPM. Same amount of power, but less RPM. And as the wing came up and we started converting, the sink rate was not getting to be less. The sink rate was getting to be more and more. We were falling out of the sky. I think the up lever had a little permanent bend in it. Roger was stronger than he thought he was. So we hit pretty good. Loved the airplane, I'll tell you about that. It really banged into the ground, and Roger and I are sitting looking at one another thinking, each is saying, you know, what the heck happened? Because we didn't know. And as I turned to look at him, I noticed that there was light back there in the cargo compartment. Now, there were no lights back there. The reason it was light back there is the airplane had broken in half and the sun was shining through. And in that light, I could see the JP-4, because the fuel tanks are all up on top of the fuselage. Because when you're landing out in the boonies, you don't want fuel in the belly of the fuselage where stumps and things would come through it. And you can't have fuel in the wings because the wing's going to be rotating and fuel sloshing that around would screw it up. So the fuselage had broken in half. We went ahead and shut the engines down. They were still running. And when we climbed out of the airplane, the tires had all exploded. The very long oleo strut that went almost up to the top of the fuselage had split. There were parts all over everything. There was fiberglass from the fiberglass props that came in contact with the ground as we put the wings down. And so, you know, but still had a clipboard on my knee and the pencil was still in. Roger and I never went to the hospital. It really did not feel like a hard landing. And I'm just amazed at LTV's design there, and it worked just like it should be. I taught airplane accident investigation for years after I got out of the Air Force, and that's a beautiful, survivable airplane to have to be able to, it's just what you want. The airplane demolishes itself, but in doing so, it absorbs all of the energy of the crash, and you come out rosy keen, nothing wrong with you. And it worked just the way it should have. There's no question in my mind, it should have been built instead of that accident-prone tilt rotor or tilt whatever, Ospreys and all of those that we're still trying. Now, one of the things that we have in here on one day and one day only, as I remember, we got all 3 ships airborne the same day. We had bleachers and people from the Army and other places out to watch our big show. And what we were doing was we're shuttling to the main base and out into the desert with various paraphernalia to demonstrate that we could do airdrops, we could deliver cargo, whatever was required to get all of those out there. And it went pretty good. It was really very interesting to see what all was there. The one film I well, you can see we offloaded a little bit of everything. That Jeep-looking thing, and I think that's a 105 howitzer he's pulling out. I happen to be flying that airplane, and the muzzle of that 105 howitzer was just about a fist width from the instruments. It was sticking between the pilot and co-pilot, in other words. It's tight fit, but as you can see, we delivered it okay. One of the funnier things that happened, and I don't have films for that, I think maybe Rob might have them. We also delivered a bag of jet fuel. They have, it looks like an inflatable bag, but it's for the Army mostly to take fuel for their helicopter operations. And it's a plastic bag that you can fill full of fuel and roll it out where they can use it. Well, we're up on this sloping hill, and when we opened up the back end and they took the restraints off of it, it rolled down the hill and kept right on rolling. And my eyeball estimate is it rolled at least 3/4 of a mile from where we were at a reasonably great speed until it finally came to a stop. Let's kill it for a time. I think I'm about. Let me tell you about one of the interesting incidents. We're getting ready to bring one of the airplanes from the factory, the first one that we're going to bring from the factory, out to Edwards. And one thing that has to happen is we have to officially accept it, which means that Stu Madison and I went out, and he's in the command seat because I'm going to get to have it from then on. And well, before we were ready to accept it, they put the airplane into the hangar and put the tri-service test team paint job and the appropriate tail numbers, troop seats, windshield washers out on the front, all of that. I think they call it 263 equipment that should go with it. And so it was just, you know, we're going to make a couple of other things around the pattern, and then I'd sign for it, and it'd be officially mine. The next day we'd go. So we took off, got about 300 feet in the air, and hit a very small bit of turbulence, and the airplane suddenly yawed, let's say left, about 3 degrees. And Stu looked at me, and I said, I didn't do anything. Guilty conscience, I guess. And so we straightened it up, and it's climbing out. We hit another little bit of turbulence, and it yawed about 3 degrees to the right. And so we straightened it up again, and like I said, we found that if we just bounce up and down in the seat, it would yaw one way or the other. Any slight disturbance, and it would yaw about 3 degrees and be very stable in that slight yaw. And so we thought, well, it must be the propeller rigging, so we just brought it back around and landed it and turned it over to maintenance to find out what was out of rig. Came back out the next morning, and maintenance says everything's rigged perfectly, there's nothing wrong with it. So we flew it again, it's doing the same thing. Well, at that point then, we alerted the flight test section, and they engaged all of their telemetry, and were looking at all the parameters, and so we took off, and it did it again. And the flight test people called on the radio and says, "What are you guys doing?" We said, "We didn't do anything." We straightened it out, and it was doing it again. So we went ahead and landed, and everybody's scratching their heads, and essentially what happened then was the LTV brass bosses said, "Okay, engineers, you can go home when you have this solved." And they went across the runway to the Navy base and brought bunk beds, you know, one over the other, 2 high bunk beds, put them in all the hallways, and started bringing in hamburgers every 3 or 4 hours. And literally, they were there. So I went back to the hotel, the swimming pool. Quite a long time there, and there wasn't anything happening. I was getting bored. I no longer went over to see how the engineers were doing, because they all had gruesome beards, and it was beginning to smell pretty bad in there. and they were very frustrated and short-tempered. So I called Stu, and we had a little meeting, and I suggested Stu, I said, look, Stu, that happened apparently when you were getting ready to deliver it. Let's take it all out. Strip it back the way it was. Take the paint off, take those seats out, put it back the way it was. Why not? I mean, there's nothing else working. So he said, that's a good idea. I'll talk to all the people. And so the next day they stripped it, put it back just the way it was. He and I went out to Fluid, and it's okay. It's fixed. But we still don't know what it was. And so the idea is, okay, well, it doesn't make sense, but we'll put the troop seats back in. So they put the troop seats back in, went out and Fluid. It's okay. I mean, still okay. That didn't do anything. Then they put all the insulation in. Okay. So they kept doing one thing. They painted it. Still okay. Wow, what the heck was it? So they put the windshield wipers on it. We took off, and it went 3 degrees to the left, bounce up and down, it'd go 3 degrees to the right. It was the windshield wipers. The windshield wipers parked like eyebrows. Instead of being off up and down, they parked straight up and down. And as you can see, it's a very blunt nose. Navy's fault. It has to go down in the carrier hole and be able to get in. If it was Air Force or Army, it would have been a little bit streamlined, but a very blunt nose. So those windshield wipers and the airflow comes up over them and causes a little bit of burble with a clear place down there. But so we took the windshield wipers back off, flew it, and it's okay. And so I signed for the airplane, put the windshield wipers in my flight suit pocket, and headed for Edwards, the long way. Interesting flight to Edwards. From Edwards, a T-33 had come down to be our chase airplane for the trip home. It was manned by a Navy commander and an Army chief of the liaison guy from the Army for the thing. And of course they parked it on the Navy ramp and walked away, and the Navy guy came running up to him and said, hey, this Air Force airplane, I've never refueled it. How do we refuel it? And the Navy guy says, don't ask me, I'm not in the Navy. And so he jumped the Army guy, and the Army guy says, hey, I'm not in the Air Force. I'm an Army guy, and besides that, I don't even know how to fly it. And he was just along for the ride. So finally, the Navy guy was smart enough to come over to LTV. They had a T-33 that they used for chase, and the T-33, the company pilot came out and showed him how to refuel it. But that gave us an inkling of how things might go. So our intention then, and our plan, was to take off and make a refueling stop at, and check the airplane out and everything at Albuquerque at Kirtland Air Force Base. So we're way out in West Texas at 30,000 feet, cruising along, and the cumulus, big old towering cumulus, is building up in front of us and getting a little bit bigger and thicker. And I thought, yeah, I can't fly AFR in this prototype airplane. Maybe we ought to go back. And besides that, I don't really know where my chase airplane was. So we made a turn 180, and golly, I couldn't even see any holes back there. They'd closed in behind us. So I thought, well, I can't go back there. So I completed the turn and headed on back toward Albuquerque, avoiding the big clouds, thinking, well, this is okay, because if it really gets bad, I'll just go down and make a hover landing in somebody's front yard, a farmer or something there, and when it clears up, we'll go on. But we were able to worm our way through it, and we're still, I don't know, maybe 100 miles out of Albuquerque. It's clear we're going to get there. And about that time, Billy O'Neill, who's my Army co-pilot, had his oxygen mask off, and he yelled at me and said, I smell fuel. And so I put my mask off, and I smell fuel also. So we kind of looked back at the deck, and pumped the stick back and forth, and there's JP4 jet fuel rolling up and down in the flight deck back there. I thought, this is not good. And about that time, the red warning light on the T-handle for emergency shutoff came on one engine. About 5 minutes later on another one. I thought, well, that's probably due to all the moisture in the air, because it wasn't really built for continuous flight, and it's a test airplane. Everything wasn't cleaned up like it should be. But it kind of bothered me that was happening at the same time we got all this fuel running around back there. So we landed at Albuquerque without incident, and opened up the back cargo doors and got the fire department out there to flush all the JP4 out and clean it out. And we went to look to see what it was. Well, I mentioned before, you probably missed it, the fuel is up high above the fuselage to get it out of the way of stumps and small arms fire or whatever. And there's a fuel drain, a little 1/4-inch line that comes down the side of the airplane, so that you can check the fuel drain like you always do on airplanes, from the outside down underneath. Or what had happened is that little line had vibrated until it broke, and so there was this little 1/4-inch line. It was pissing fuel all over the floor back there. So while everybody's scratching their heads, I walked around the ramp and finally found a little piece of wood, grabbed my pocket knife and made a nice short point on it and took it back in there and jammed it up there and whacked it a few times and put some duct tape around it, and we got refueled and went on to Edwards without any further ado or incidents. So it was a pretty versatile airplane, and always felt like there was a choice, something that you could do, because you could land it like a normal airplane, like a C-130. You could land it at 32 knots or 65 knots, whatever wing angle you wanted, or you could hover it and put it straight down in some very confined area. I'm sorry that we didn't go ahead and have tons of them. It's a very great airplane. Okay. Wow.
That's lame.
It's funny.
It's lame. Well, that's extreme walking for you. Go ahead and try it at home. Just don't sue me if you fall. Extreme.
So you're rocking out. And maybe I'll make them small, and I'll show them.
Well, I'm